Great, well, thank you, Tim. I really appreciate that, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be back here once again at the Grange. As Tim mentioned, the theme for the conference this year is the tip of the innovation spear, which sounds a little implausible in many ways, but actually signifies how corporate venturing is starting to help the venture industry as a whole scale up, but also is just one of the innovation tools that corporations are increasingly relying on in a part of their innovation strategy. So we've got a panel run by Gatz at Proseeder, which will follow this and look more holistically at the venture industry. But I wanted to provide a few thoughts about these themes, just a couple of data slides that we've seen. But before I wanted to do that, I want to say thanks to everyone in the room. We've got about $2.5 trillion of aggregate annual revenue among the corporations that are attending here. So that's quite a sizable sum. For context, the UK GDP last year was about $2.8 trillion. So we've got about the UK's GDP in this room flying in. So thank you very much for all those who've made the time and effort. But the theme of the conference, as I described, is this sort of tip of the innovation spear. So I took a look at the sort of top 2,500 companies by R&D. It's very handily provided by the European Commission. And that's about 90% of global R&D budgets that they reckon. But the top 100 of those companies are about 53% of that total. And so what I was interested in is, if you look at those companies, are they increasing on the whole or decreasing the amount of money they're spending on R&D? But what is happening to the rest of their innovation tool set? Are they increasing or decreasing R&D, but maybe increasing M&A or corporate venturing to compensate? And so if you take the top 25%, which is about a quarter of that total in aggregate, what you find is that about 6 of them are decreasing their R&D year on year. So last year to this year, 6 of them are decreasing the amount of R&D spend. But if you also look at the R&D intensity, how much they spend on R&D as a percentage of their turnover or net sales, then you also find another 4 or so have declined by net intensity. So about 10 of the 25 have declined R&D. But in compensation, what many of them are doing, in fact, the majority are doing, are actually increasing the amount of innovation they're trying to get more short-term by using M&A and corporate venture capital to try and say, how do we reach out to that outside world and bring that innovation back in and complement to the R&D that's also going on? So this Venn diagram is effectively trying to say that corporate venture capital has been increasing for almost all of those 25, that top 25. M&A is also increasing both by volume and by value. There's an increasing number of consolidation as we've been witnessing over the past few years in particular. But if you look then at specifically at the corporate venture capital piece, what you find is that if you compare it to VCs, and so we're delighted to have worked with PitchBook for this bit of analysis. They took the sort of VCs as a sort of ex-corporate venture capital. We then, using our sort of greater database, were able to add in the sort of corporate venture piece together. A better reflection of what's been going on is that you find that corporations that are active in terms of smaller deals, sub-10 million types deals, there's about 500 or so they do out of the 1,000 per year. But obviously that's only a small percentage of the number of overall venture deals. But as you start to increase the deal round size, then corporations are increasingly involved and increasingly leading and driving up the scale of the venture industry. So as you take this sort of chart, they're about a third of the sort of 10 to 100 million type deals. Go up to 100 to nearly $1 billion in deals, there are more than 50%. And as you get to $1 billion plus, actually corporations are much more active. So there's one VC-led round, which was $1 billion plus in the Q1 this year, but there were 4 in total. And so CVCs are active and leading many of those very big deals, and particularly out of Asia, particularly out of sort of China, we're seeing many of these big deals being done. And so the other part which is helping the venture industry scale up is both, sort of overall total, the overall numbers of deals, but equally corporations, by dint of the fact that they're multinational, are increasingly international. And so, again, if you compare them to VCs, we're delighted, again, PitchBook to have helped provide some of these figures. If you look at the VCs X corporate venture capital, about 3 out of 10, so about a third of VCs invest outside of their home country. If you look at corporations, or CVCs by contrast, more than 50% of them. So by dint of their parents saying, we're interested in innovation, not just where we're based, in Germany or China or Japan or wherever it might be, but we're interested in what's going on outside in that rest of the world, and we're bringing in, and we were prepared to invest in that time, resource, and effort to try and help you do that, then we're finding that the corporate venture community is instrumental in this globalization issue, that entrepreneurs want to be global almost from day one. VCs are very much local, but corporations are saying, we can help you, we can provide that money, we can provide you with the resources and customers to do that. And increasingly for the entrepreneurs that want to scale, that want to go more global more quickly, the corporations are becoming a primary or preferred option. So I won't say anything more on that. I will have great pleasure in inviting to the stage Ken Gatz, founder and CEO of Proseeder. He will then sort of introduce the rest of the panel and bring them up onto the stage. I will then join that panel as well, and then we'll run through, because we're delighted to have a little bit more data and have a bit of discussion. Ken, please join to the stage.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ken Gatz. I am the CEO and founder of Proseeder Technologies. Proseeder deploys technology into corporate venture units, so we're very closely aligned to seeing what's going on in the industry. Jim, when I first saw the graphic for the tip of the innovation spear, I was thinking to myself, oh, this is a little overly dramatic, right? But it's really not. There's a battle going on right now. There's a battle going on for ideas, for innovation, and actually for the talent contained within the teams that are being addressed here. And your units, in how you engage with the early stage ecosystem, really are the tip of the innovation spear. And the decisions that you make and the way that you form these units and how you transform these units over time to adapt to these changing conditions are going to impact your corporations over the next several years. And we're going to take a look at a study of how that's being done. So I'd like to kind of invite to the stage first Ilya Strebulaev from Stanford Business School. As well as Will Gornall, who have done a study on the different variations of how corporate venture units are formed and the way that compensation is structured, as well as George Ugras, the head of IBM Ventures, managing director, very well known. Welcome.
Everybody knows me in my house, yeah.
So with that, to take a look at the, do you have the clicker?
Ilya's got it, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so why don't you get right into your study and start talking, maybe tell us about what you guys have found.
Okay, so good morning, everybody. About a couple of years ago, my colleagues and I, so Will Gornall from the University of British Columbia, who's here, but also Steve Kaplan from the University of Chicago, and Paul Gompers from Harvard, started doing a major study of traditional institutional venture capitalists. We did a survey of more than 1,000 of VCs. If you're interested, it's available online. We asked more than 80 questions, and we learned a lot of interesting new things about venture capitalists. But then the question arose, how do traditional VCs compare with corporate venture capitalists? And we didn't really know the answer to this question. Just as a way of background, I've developed and been teaching a venture capital course at the Stanford MBA program, which has been quite popular, because I think most of our MBA students would like to go out and start their new companies. But in the first years of this course, corporate venture capital was not mentioned at all. And when I taught it last year, for the first time, we had one session on corporate venture capital. And I guess in years forward, we're going to have more and more sessions on corporate venture capital. But we didn't really know much about you, how you make decisions, how you operate, how you get compensated, and so on. And so with the help of Jim and Global Corporate Venturing, thank you very much, we decided to continue this analysis and go from traditional VCs to corporate VCs. So we done the same kind of similar major survey of corporate venture capitalists. We have more than 400 responses from global CVCs. I'm sure many of the respondents are here, so I would like to use again this opportunity to thank you. So we're going to, and then for those of you who went to Sonoma in February, I presented some preliminary results. We're going to release major results of the survey very soon, so check us online pretty soon. But we would like to use this couple of minutes to share with you just some interesting results about one specific area that you might find very interesting, and we'll share these results with you.
Fabulous. Well, thank you again, James, for your thought leadership here. It's been in the academic circles, we know very little about corporate venture capital, despite it becoming so important. And we're very happy to have the cooperation of global corporate venturing to help put the study together.
Well, thank you. It's been my pleasure.
So there are many questions we asked in this survey. I just have time to talk about a couple of them. So we tried to pick the results which we thought might be the most interesting and the most exciting, which turned out to be compensation. So here's a slide you can take back to your CEO to ask for more money. Basically, one of the things we looked at in the survey was how compensation and how compensation structure is related to performance, both strategic and financial performance. This is a simple slide looking at the performance among funds that pay carried interest versus funds that don't pay incentive pay. In green, we have the cash-on-cash multiple on the left and the average IRR on the right of funds that pay carried interest. In brown, we have those same numbers for funds that do not use incentive pay. And what we're finding, what was strong and consistent in our results, was that funds that use more incentive pay seem to have higher performance. Funds that are using the higher powered incentive that institutional venture capitalists use seem to have better financial returns. So like I said, take that home to your boss. On the other hand, that's not quite the full story. One of the things that's coming out of this survey is the huge variety, the huge diversity amongst corporate venture capital funds. We see funds that are more financially focused, but many are extremely strategically focused, putting strategic goals far above financial returns. And if you break down funds by their strategic and financial focus, you'll see that in some ways, funds are getting what they pay for. There's an English expression that he who pays the piper calls the tune. That's really what we saw in our results on compensation. Funds that set their compensation, that set their KPIs up around financial metrics, seem to excel on financial metrics. But the managers of those funds seem to be putting strategic goals in second place to getting the best financial returns. On the other hand, funds that set up their incentives around strategic goals have managers that prioritize fit above all else, but they seem to be lagging on financial returns. So the structure of compensation, the structure of the incentive structures that these funds put in is having a large impact on the decisions managers make and on the types of results they're realizing. On the left, we find the more financial based your performance measures are, the less your managers care about fit, but the higher realized IRRs they receive.
Yeah. Did you ask them how well they did on strategic imperatives?
No, and that's something that after doing the study, there are several questions that are hinting at that, but that's something that's incredibly difficult to measure. We hope you can shed some light on how you work towards that.
We have so much wisdom on that, yeah. No, I'm kidding.
So George, you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, I mean, you get what you pay for, and I think it's like every conference we've had, we always have this discussion, are we financial and strategic, and maybe we can just not have that discussion anymore. Can we just agree? We're not going to have that discussion anymore. And look, I work for a $100 billion type market cap company. I think achieving an IRR of 20% competing against Sequoia and Kleiner is probably meaningless for my company. Yes. Because if I, as the best performer on Sand Hill Road, if I beat the top quartile of Cambridge Associates performance, I will not move the needle in earnings per share in my company. So what's the point? So I think it's a little odd to do that comparison for CVCs with financial investors. I think the IRR-driven compensation is relevant only because, in my experience, you do want to be with the good companies. The good companies have bigger impact, hence you want to incentivize your people to invest in the best companies out there. And that should tie into compensation somehow. But the metric of success should not be financial, it should be around strategic. So that's a tough equation to resolve because it hits a lot of soft factors. But there are CVCs that I think over the years have done that quite well, like doing surveys of BUs and stuff. But it's soft. It's soft numbers, not hard numbers. Anyway, I think this is a very cool study. Yeah. I am taking it back, no doubt.
What I would say, what we're seeing very much in line with what George is saying is that your role, or at least the roles that we're seeing of the strongest corporate venture units, are not focused on financial returns. They really are not. As this slide shows, you know, they set out a process of the ones that are really the most established and well organized, and ones that we consult with in setting up the structure. And so the first thing is to set, what is the strategic objectives of the corporation, right? What are we trying to achieve? What innovation, what weaknesses do we have? What new markets do we want to enter? Where do we want to defend against disruption? Where do we want to increase profitability by bringing in additional technology, and again, teams? Because if you think of people who are graduating from Stanford, they're not necessarily going and wanting to work for the largest corporations in the world anymore, right? What they are doing, because the cost of starting a new company is now $500,000. So they want to go out and they want to be a startup company. So a lot of the talent is actually outside of these large corporations. So by engaging with them in a variety of different ways, and it's not just venture, it's not just investing, it's partnerships and licensing, letting them do pilots, having them have exposure to your clients, to have real world deployments. These are very valuable things that VCs don't have the capability to do. VCs only are interested in the last modality of innovation here, which is financial return, right? They don't have any of the other aspects. They do not have to see a nexus between the business unit and the startup. They don't have all of those different aspects to their business. They also don't have the subject matter expertise within their organizations to address new technologies that are coming in. So corporations are very well set up to focus on the strategic nature of these investments, and money is just one modality. It's just one weapon that you have, arrow in your quiver or spear to be able to use to engage with these startups. So with that,
should we just start chirping away?
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I think, look, one of the things that is really interesting from a corporate venturing standpoint is you are friends and enemies with multiple people within the organization, right? So a lot of people, and we were talking to Marianne last night from J&J, for example, right? So in pharmaceuticals, right, they got into, J&J is probably the longest, the oldest, I hate that word oldest, but longest serving or existing CVC out there. And one of the reasons, most experienced, oh, good. Wise. But you're really an alternative to R&D in the pharmaceutical case, and you have people inside working on R&D. So we have this at IBM. We're one of the largest research organizations in the world, and at the same time, I'm investing in startups that are providing an alternative pathway. So there are these conflicts that you have to manage. I think that is a big thing. A big burden to bear in terms of innovation, because most people think of R&D as the spear, and I think external R&D really started by pharmaceuticals, right? Yeah. And then that expanded into semiconductors and other people, and then there are things like ecosystem construction, which are much more easier, like the stuff that Intel Capital did in its early days, which was to build this x86 ecosystem to push their stuff. Going forward, because it's much more of a software and data-driven world, I think those conflicts are going to be much more difficult to manage. And I think CVCs have to achieve a higher level of sophistication in how they manage that. And on this chart, one just quick comment. In my years in doing venture, I'm new to CVC side, you're always looking at technology disruption as an investor, as the driver, right? And the piece that gets lost is business model innovation. And if you look at the big money made and companies that have changed our lives, They primarily have innovated on business models, much more so than on technology, if you really think about it. And I think that's something that gets missed in our community quite a bit, where, I mean, I'm a physicist by training and an engineer and whatever, and we're gearheads, and we're looking at tech, but things like, sharing economy or, shared ledgers, right, blockchain, et cetera. Yeah, these are, you could argue they're tech-enabled things, and you have to catch the technology, but the business model innovation that you bring into your company, which a lot of people are not capable of thinking about, is probably the biggest impact you're going to have, versus a new piece of material science or compound or a new piece of software. I think business model innovation requires a lot of external outlook because your executives are not thinking about it.
I mean, if I could pick up on that, actually, George, it does seem to be, if you think about some of the most disruptive companies of the past generation, whether it's an Airbnb or even an Uber, they are very asset light, but they're very impactful. And it's all to do with the sort of business models. There's nothing really new about the technology that they apply. It's just they're trying to say, we can do and we can scale by turning other people's assets and ownership into that. And
I mean, a lot of people think Apple, Steve Jobs was a genius because he took a bunch of components from China and built a phone. No, it was iTunes. The guy figured out that you want to carry your music with you, and he figured out that you would pay 99 cents per song. It was a business model that he came up with. The iPhone was just a carrier of the model, right? So anyway, and the other piece, I don't know how much we'll be able to talk about it the next couple of days, but I think 3 or 4 years ago, I was on stage and we talked a lot about data. And if you look at a lot of the things that you have on this chart and what's happened in the past, especially 12 months, the explosion of usage of machine learning, I won't say AI, just a little overused, is so prevalent. And it's really impacting, I think, just about every business out there. And the big challenge for the groups represented here is if you're not Amazon or Google or Apple, right, where you have gobs and gobs of data to train your systems on, what are you going to do in AI? How are you going to win? And you probably do not have enough thinking going on about this inside your companies, would be my guess today. So when you think about the innovation sphere and who you want to skewer next, I guess, or
who you want to stick it to,
that's an area I would really focus on. And I would say that there is probably imaginative things. I mean, I'm starting to do this in my team at IBM, where obviously it's a huge advantage for us because 90% of data still sits in corporates, interestingly. The consumer stuff is elsewhere, but banks and industrial companies, et cetera, have gobs of data, and IBM manages a lot of those data assets. So there's a real opportunity to do some creative things on that front. I think that'll be probably an area that you're going to be very busy with over the next few years, would be my assumption.
Yeah, and one question, actually, George, I'm very much in line with you on this strategic return on investment. And what I would ask the professors is, and this is something that we're constantly working on at Proseeder and trying to, how do we measure return on investment, on strategic investment, right? On the impact of the corporation in bringing in new technology, new teams, and also what we call the anti-portfolio, right? So LinkedIn is a good example, right? So you're not going to have an exit return on LinkedIn, right? It's part of Microsoft, so there's really no. The investors, and Reid Hoffman has a return on investment and IRR on that, but how is that going to impact Microsoft? Is it positive? Is it negative? And the other part is that's not a spear to me that as a weapon. That's a nuke, right? So that LinkedIn is off the market. So if you're a competitor of Microsoft, okay, that's gone. That asset is now gone and is not going to be coming back. Those users, that engagement level, and so that the impact on the larger corporation. How do you assess that?
So I think it is absolutely true that I completely agree with you that unless you have strategic goals in place, it does make sense to go into corporate venturing because you can't compete with the Sand Hill Road. At the same time, I think our results show that there's a very substantial correlation between compensation and returns. And as a result, it's unlikely that companies will be able, your bosses will be able to cover your losses for a long time. So you really need to perform financially as well, in addition to it strategically. Exactly because strategically is very difficult to show, while financially is very easy to measure. So people tend to look at what is easier to measure. So if it turns out that your corporate venture unit is losing money consistently, then your CFO will be very unhappy, and then your CEO will be unhappy. Going back to how measure strategic performance, at the end of the day, finance came up with only really one big measure, which is shareholder value. And one way to look at Microsoft and LinkedIn is to look at what's happening with the shareholder value of Microsoft when it acquired LinkedIn, which is a very large acquisition. With smaller acquisitions, it's much more difficult to realize on the bigger perspective how. But I think there are many, many ways to measure this. Other ways, through the ability to hire better employees, for example. That's, I think, a very important measure. Or through the ability to get new products out of the market. But at the end of the day, we care only about shareholder value. Do you want to add anything?
Sure, and in putting together our survey, we're struggling with exactly this question. How can we measure the value creation, the strategic value? And I'm sure that's a question everyone in this room struggles with. How do you measure the strategic value that your venture capital unit is creating? And for us, it's possibly even harder. When you try to combine strategic value, how much strategic value does your CVC generate? Not very much, a little, a lot. How do we put that into a survey and get responses from everyone from biotech companies to industrial companies to banks? How do we combine those and how do we aggregate those?
Yeah, I think, look, this pursuit for homogeneous structures and answers for corporate venturing are very tough, because I'm in a very, very different business. I'm in a very different stage. I'm addressing a very different set of priorities than my counterpart in any company, right? It's a completely moving target. I mean, I don't know how much money we spent at IBM on developing quantum computing, for example. And there are only a couple of companies who've done that globally, right? How do you measure your return on investing behind quantum computing? Right? I mean, it's going to be a while. But there is clearly a disruption coming down the pike that's going to be caused by that, and that's worse. So anyway, there are, I think, a couple of things. One, if you are somewhere where they're spending money on research, right? I mean, pharmaceuticals have had a model that really works, the pipeline model. And you can certainly do some optionality value and with some discounting and Monte Carlo simulations, come up with some net present value of venture with regard to return distribution from research investments and justify it that way. I think the much more relevant metric is how much you're opening up white spaces for the corporation that didn't exist before. Because all of us are going after that. Protecting existing franchises should not be part of the venture model. I think that's a very dangerous zero-sum game that you get caught up in. And for the models themselves, so they paid me to be on stage to make these disruptive remarks to wake you guys all up. It's like 2 a.m. for me, so no excuse to be asleep. But look, it's my opinion that I don't think any corporate venturing model should be static for more than 2 or 3 years. So if every 2 or 3 years you're not changing your own model, including your people, right, something is off. You should evolve. This is not, I think, something that should be different from financial VCs raise funds. I've done it for 15 years. You have a 10-year horizon on the fund. You have a commitment. It's very easy, simple structure, what you're trying to get done, what LPs are looking for. In the CVC model, right, as the corporate piece evolves, you should evolve. And the compensation scheme probably should evolve alongside that.
Actually, if I could pick up on that, George, I mean, it's quite an interesting point, because if you look at there's about 1,667 corporations that have done a deal at some point over the past 5 years, which is a lot. But if you look at the 140 plus with a more than a 10-year track record, and you talk to them and you see the evolution, it's exactly to your point. You know, there is that change. What they started, how they need to convince senior management of what they need to do to start a corporate venture unit, and how they evolve, how they get through that 3 to 5 year sort of, not quite valley of death, but the sort of lack of enthusiasm that can sometimes form within senior management as there's a new CEO or change to CFO or strategic decisions evolve, you know, is quite challenging. But to get through that and then into 10 years, almost none of them, in fact, we couldn't find a single one that had the same strategy after 10 years that they had at the start. And I think it's that point of evolution, that what you need to be doing to take yourself onto the next step is usually has to be very different. And I think it's exactly that point.
I mean, the challenges with the entrepreneurs you're working with, obviously, you know, they're looking for a long-term partnership and a long-term relationship, and that needs to happen with the people who are going to impact their business, which should really be the business line managers, because they're partnering with you either around R&D, distribution, something like that, right? That you got to make sure that has continuity and longevity. But getting into that trap of looking at yourself as a long-term, you know, financial participant, I think is a little risky.
Actually, if I could pick up on the second point that you were raising there, George, because it's, you know, really fascinating subject to me, you know, is this idea that where the corporation comes from has a direct impact on what they seem to be trying to do. And you mentioned that sort of corporate venture capital shouldn't necessarily be trying to defend a business unit. But if you look at the established CVCs, particularly from, you know, we're here in Europe, a home of many of the established incumbent industries, that's exactly how they're starting out. They're saying, we're worried by a Tesla coming in and affecting automotive, so how do we develop East Saxony into a sort of automotive hub? We're worried about, you know, the three big industries, when you look at it on the slide in terms of R&D, it's healthcare. In terms of R&D, it's healthcare, it's energy companies, it's industrial companies like automotive, and it's the big tech companies. And if you look at those established industries, healthcare, the industrial sort of automotive sector in particular, are saying, how do we respond to this? How do we defend ourselves against these new tech incumbencies and insurgencies? Whereas newer companies, which are often still led by the founder or founder-CEO combination, are very much saying, how do we take where we started from and expand? How do we, as Alibaba or Tencent, invest 5 billion plus of equity per year in corporate venture capital in 100 plus deals, plus do a lot of 100 plus LP commitments as Tencent over the past few years, and say, how do we expand out? How do we do, you know, gaming, which is 60% of their revenues currently, but how do we expand out in ride sharing, into AI? How do we expand out that vision? And I think very much where you are as a corporation in terms of your mindset, are we trying to defend or are we trying to expand, has a direct correlation we see in terms of the level of activity and the overall success.
Yeah, I think it's the level of threat, right? So if you look at Walmart, right, who is being threatened by their business model by Amazon, right? So they are defending their territory, which is retail, right? They went out and bought Jet for $3 billion. They're investing heavily in new technologies. They understand that they are under threat by a very large, competent competitor, and they're in a fight for their existence, right? So there are, depending on the level of threat, I think sometimes you're going to take those defensive large steps. One thing, George, I wanted to ask you was, you know, I think a lot of the outward engagement with the early stage ecosystem and why the early stage ecosystem is so innovative, you know, and as an entrepreneur, is that we can change things very, very rapidly, right? We can change, you know, we see new concepts, we see new demands within the industry. We're very easily able to adapt to those, where the larger corporations, it's harder to turn those ships, right? And so we have constant innovation going on within our organization, both how we do things and the products that we're providing. When you bring these early stage companies in and you bring them closer and align them with these business units, how do you maintain that level of agility and startup and I had this conversation last night with a new venture fund out of a large energy company here that wants to bring this team in, but kind of is afraid in how it will react with. Will it lose its competitive ability? Will it become more bureaucratic within the larger organization? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, it will eventually become. I mean, there is I think an intrinsic dilemma there that will always exist. The balance between agility and stability, because companies like us, we have almost every company here represented as a customer of IBM in some shape or form. And people come to us a lot because they trust us, and you build that trust over a very long time period, right? Whereas, so the whole concept of minimum viable product and how you define that is very different where I live now versus when I ran startups. So, and that exists in other industries as well. It's not just us. So there are a few things there. One, I use this phrase internally. Called the golden thread, which I didn't come up with at all. But it works. The way I define it is basically find an engagement that is single-threaded, where you can very easily pave the path to success and gate it through people that you vetted yourself, that you intrinsically trust will make it work. And that has to be on all sides of the equation, because there are people at startups who are bulls in a china shop, and it's not going to work, right? And there are people internal to the companies that are just going to be far too bureaucratic. So you pave that pathway, and it's a lot of work to do, but once you do it, it actually works. You find the right people, find the metric of success, and say, here's what we're going to get done. This is not some huge convoluted thing. No, we're going to serve this one customer, right, with this product, within this time frame, and here's how the success looks like. And that works. If you keep it broad and say, hey, there's this great startup, we have this great division, the GM should have dinner with the CEO, see what they can do together, over a bottle of wine. No. At least stylistically, that doesn't work for me. And then once people see one thing work, it expands from there. And they go, oh, okay, nobody got hurt, let's do more of this.
I think that's a good point, actually, in terms of the personnel. If you think about R&D, very much it's, get established people, get the scientists, give them freedom and time and goals, and they go out and do that. But actually, if you're trying to think about new business models or cultural change, it's how do you bring that in? The M&A can do that, but how do you ally that with working with the entrepreneurial startups? It's a really difficult challenge, but you do see, the Walmart sort of Jet is a perfect example. They say, okay, we'll bring you in, we'll take you, and we'll try and get a whole new team. IBM have been a perfect example of a triple wave company that's done that through that evolutionary process.
Yeah, I think the big acquisition for us on that front was the weather company, which a lot of people thought we were buying a company that was just like analytics and stuff. Actually, they have built the world's best data ingestion engine that anybody has for structured and unstructured data. And it's now becoming the foundation for Watson. And that was a very startup-ish culture, right? And again, the way I work with that team is around, even though they're kind of startup-ish people, now it's a very big operation. When you bring things in, you got to really thread it through. If I find myself in a room with more than 5 or 6 people, I tend to leave. And I highly recommend that. Aside from current company, because look, it's if you want to these internal alignment things and stuff, there's a lot of that goes on. But if you're trying to actually get a startup engagement going, you need to do it with 2 or 3 people. There's got to be real accountability, and the selection of who that is internally is absolutely critical because that person has to be the champion of making it succeed.
George, are those people that are engaging with the early stage ecosystem in these, is it only the corporate venture units, or are you seeing more and more the
No, it better not be.
Okay.
Actually. No, that would be horrible.
Yes. So could you explain how that works?
No, it has to be, I'd love to get to product people. I mean, I think the world is defined by product managers, as far as I'm concerned. And you got to get to product management. They're very busy. Those are difficult people. If you can't, then you got to get to people who are driving whatever success. So for a lot of the startups I work with, what they want is go to market, right? There, I go with somebody who can actually help them expand and scale and start with 1 or 2 cases. And then, so those are go-to-market type capabilities. If it's a product thing, so we're looking at technology or business model disruption, I have to get to the product manager. If the product people are not excited, you can bang your head against the wall. It's not going to work.
Yeah, so I think, to summarize, I think a lot of what we heard here is that, VCs and the VC approach, a traditional VC approach where you're looking for financial returns and you're putting money out there in hopes that some of these things are going to strategically align, we're definitely seeing a shift very much away from that and much more towards strategic alignment with the corporation in the startups and the outreach of what's going on. And that's it's a very different it's a very different tool set that you need in order to make sure that the VCs don't have to worry about a lot of these things. They don't have to worry about the alignment with the business units. All they have to worry about is financial return and returning that money to their partners. Yes, they're both venture. Okay, they're both utilizing capital as a modality to engage with these startups, but the ability for corporates to both get a tremendous strategic advantage. So like you said, there could be a startup that you could bring on that there may be no financial return, but yet it could to the bottom line of the corporation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just do one plug for the conference here, if I may, which is, I attend a few of these a year. Sometimes I can make it one, whatever, but the interesting bit to me is this, right? If you go to, I've served on the MSCA, which is the financial VC fight, where you go to these meetings of financial VCs, it's always the same thing. Everybody's pounding their chest on the best deal they've done, and it's the same model. Okay, great, you're taller and better looking, whatever. One great thing about this gathering, and I think this is very important for the next couple of days, is it is an evolving model that you need to advocate internally and run. So it's a discovery process that's enabled by these exchanges that happen in the hallway here that I think are extremely critical to your success and the evolution of the models, because what I'm doing is probably not going to work for you, right? So you got to come up with that. The only way you come up with those models is by talking to other people. The only downside is I actually would like my money back because I'm not going to see you in a gladiator outfit. True?
Sadly,
yeah,
no, not me, unfortunately. No,
this is a real bummer.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone, and enterprise on. So.